plus Senator Simitian, then Senator Lowenthal, and Senator Alquist.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and with your patience, Senator Leno, I want to begin with a regional issue and drill down on that a little bit. Mr. Morales, I believe you were familiar with the discussion of the blended system that took place between representatives of the High-Speed Rail Authority and Assemblymember Rich Gordon, myself, and Congresswoman Anna Eshoo commencing back in April of 2011. I think that while you were not in your current position, you were at Parsons at that time and aware of the conversation. Am I remembering correctly?
Senator, I was not actually involved in the project at the time, but I certainly was aware of them through press reports and general context, and have become more aware over time.
All right. Well, here's the dilemma. And just by way of background, Mr. Chairman, after 2.5 years of asking the High-Speed Rail Authority to put a plan in front of us that was, by my characterization, high-speed rail done right, and not seeing something that fit that description for the 55-mile corridor from San Francisco to San Jose, Assemblymember Gordon and Congresswoman Eshoo and I finally said maybe it would be helpful if we provided some notion of what high-speed rail done right looks like in that corridor. And our fundamental premise was that it didn't make sense to spend billions we didn't have to build a duplicative system side by side with an existing rail corridor, creating both more disruption and more opposition than was necessary. And our argument was that we ought to create something called a blended system, a phrase that didn't exist then in this conversation, and integrate high-speed rail with a 21st century Caltrain, that is our commuter system along that corridor. And that could be done with 3 critical agreements from the High-Speed Rail Authority. Number 1, abandon the idea of a 60-foot viaduct up and down the corridor. Number 2, stay within the existing right-of-way. And number 3, abandon the EIR that called for the eventual construction of a full-blown mega project over time so that businesses and homeowners up and down the corridor could reasonably plan for the future of their properties. It took some struggle, but over time, the reaction we got, or the response we got, was, yes, we can adopt the blended system, and we will, number 1, not do a 60-foot viaduct until or unless somebody tells us they'd like it in their neighborhood, some city or unincorporated county. Number 2, we can stay substantially within the existing right-of-way, substantially, of course, being in the eye of the beholder. So we had a little conversation about what substantially meant, and the answer was within 5 or 10 extra feet of the existing right-of-way. And number 3, an issue where we got stuck for a while, was the issue of the programmatic EIR moving forward with a full-blown mega project, a 4-track system, and a concern that any alteration there could set the project back, but an understanding or commitment that the project level EIR would move forward with no notion of a mega project in mind. The conversation was had at the highest levels, and Assemblymember Gordon and I, in fact, sat in our offices here in the Capitol with Rolf Van Ark, your predecessor, and he made commitments on the first 2. In subsequent hearings, and Mr. Chairman, Senators Lowenthal and DeSaulnier have been in these hearings, Mr. Richards has been kind enough to indicate that while the EIR might not be a way to address this, that there were other ways to address the long-term commitment not to build what I have described as a mega project. The challenge is that the language we have in front of us does not codify those commitments. I offered language that I thought would be helpful in that regard some weeks ago through the leadership in my House. The High-Speed Rail Authority and or the administration said that they thought it was unduly limiting in terms of flexibility. We've since had conversations about how this commitment, assuming that it remains in place and is real, can be memorialized. One possibility, and I would suggest all 3 of these are necessary, one possibility is to do a letter to the Journal, which has modest import and is not in fact a matter of law, but it's helpful. The second possibility is to communicate these commitments formally and in writing to the mayors of the various communities up and down the corridor from San Francisco to San Jose. And the third is to put at least some intent language that the legislature, if it takes action on this matter, does so with the understanding that there is this commitment to a blended system along the lines that I've described, but put that language in statute so that it is a matter of law, even if it's only intent. We don't have any language like that in front of us. My question is, are you prepared to honor the commitments that have been made by the authority to date in that regard, and are you willing to memorialize them in those three ways? If not, it's going to be very hard, given the fact that it has now been a year and 3 months since the April 2011 conversation. It's going to be very hard for people to believe that the commitment that's been articulated publicly is real and meaningful going forward.
And I'll first answer very succinctly, which, yes. And I'll expand a little more. Yes, on the 3 points that you raised, absolutely. We are in concurrence with you on the value of those and what the message of those could be. That would clarify that, in fact, our intent is to go forward with the blended system on the peninsula as proposed by you and Congresswoman Eshoo and Assemblymember Gordon. That is what is in our business plan. That was a very conscious decision to make that decision. That is what we have requested going forward. And one thing I would point to, and I recognize it doesn't necessarily address all of the concerns, but there is language in here which is important to note that we completely agreed with, including which says that none of the funds that are being appropriated in this act can be used to plan or design anything on the peninsula beyond the blended approach.
And if I could just interrupt for a minute, and Mr. Chairman, I direct this comment to you, sir, because my understanding is you'll be the person taking the measure up on the floor as our chair. The language, and I appreciate it, that Mr. Morales correctly comments on, is contained on pages 2, pages 3, and pages 4, and indicates that the funding that's being allocated, quote, shall not be used to expand the blended system to a dedicated 4-track system. That being said, there's no commitment in that language to further funding, and since we're talking about an allocation of 10 or 15% of the total project cost, that means that 85 or 90% of the funds will be forthcoming at some point in the future from some other source. And of course, the language that's there now doesn't provide any assurances that those funds wouldn't be used to expand the project in a way that was inconsistent with the understanding that I think we do have. So I think, Mr. Chairman, if you could play a constructive role, if you were willing, and I was going to say I don't mean to put you on the spot. Of course, that would be inaccurate. I do mean to put you on the spot.
Oh, I'm there.
And that has to do with a letter to the Journal, the commitment to provide a letter to mayors of the relevant jurisdictions up and down the corridor, and some kind of language, and at this point I gather it's not going to be forthcoming between now and the end of session tomorrow, but some kind of language before the end of our session that at least memorializes in a statute the intent of the legislature that this is the set of limitations that shall apply consistent with the decision to move forward on high-speed rail, should that be the will of the legislature. And Mr. Morales, is there a reason why that would be problematic?
None whatsoever.
Right,
Could I just reinforce one other?
Of course,
please,
right ahead.
On the language that is contained in the bill, and again, I recognize, Senator Simitian, it doesn't accomplish everything you're looking to do, but I do want to make sure that there is an understanding of what it does do. We can only work on anything for which we receive an appropriation. And so if the appropriation specifies that we cannot use the funds that are appropriated for a given activity, in this case planning beyond the blended system, we cannot advance that work. So it doesn't affect future appropriations. We're in agreement on that, but it does. I do think people should be clear. If this language is approved and enacted, the authority would not be able to do any work on anything beyond the blended option on the peninsula.
I understand. I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. As I'm sure you can understand, the concern, of course, is longer than the 5 or 10 year period that these funds might be contained in. Folks who have business properties or homes up and down the corridor who might wish to sell or might wish to perform additional construction on their properties are trying to understand, not just for 5 or 10 years, but for 20, 30 years and beyond, what they do or don't have to live with and what a prospective purchaser would or would not have to live with as well. So I appreciate the willingness to try and spell out a longer-term commitment in a more meaningful way, and I think that's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Morales.